The morning sun of the Galactic Military Academy burned bright orange through the massive windows of the assembly hall, and every single cadet in the enormous room felt their stomach turned with fear and anxiety, except for one human who sat in the back row looking like he was about to fall asleep. Kong Tae was his name, and he was a 24-year-old human male with short black hair and calm dark eyes, and he sat with his arms crossed over his chest and his eyes half closed while the alien cadets around him whispered in panic about the announcement that had just shaken everyone to their core. The survival exam was beginning tomorrow and nobody was ready. Instructor Vel stood at the front of the hall, and he was a tall, imposing figure with gray skin that seemed to shine under the bright lights and 4 muscular arms that were clasped behind his back in a military posture, and his dark yellow eyes looked over the 300 cadets with an expression that showed no sympathy or mercy. "Will be dropped alone on the jungle moon of Vareth 7, he said in his deep, rumbling voice that echoed through the silent hall and made several cadets flinch with every word. "And you will survive for 72 hours with nothing but a standard survival knife and the clothes on your back." Hey, Tesserae cadet named Rico, who sat 3 rows ahead of Tay, raised his clawed hand into the air, and his green scales caught the light as he spoke with confidence in his voice that was clearly meant to impress the instructors and his fellow cadets. "Instructor Vel," he said in a loud, clear voice, "and what exactly is the failure rate for this examination, if I may ask?" Vel looked at him without blinking his yellow eyes, and the silence stretched for several uncomfortable seconds before he finally answered in a flat, emotionless tone, 40% of cadets fail this examination," he said, "and deaths occur every single cycle without exception." The hall erupted in nervous chatter, and cadets of every species began talking over each other with fear and desperation in their voices, and some of them looked like they might cry right there in their seats, and others looked like they were considering running away from the academy entirely. And never coming back. To yawned and stretched his arms above his head and cracked his neck with a satisfying papuna. Park, who sat in the seat directly next to Tay, leaned over toward him, and her long black hair fell over her shoulder as she whispered to him with wide, disbelieving eyes, "Seriously, not even a little bit worried about this?" she asked him, and her voice was a mixture of concern and amazement. Opened one eye slowly and looked at her with a calm expression that seemed completely out of place in the panicking crowd, and then he shrugged his broad shoulders and said in a casual tone, "I was actually wondering if I could bring a book to read, because 72 hours sounds like a long time to have nothing to do." Nuna stared at him for a long moment with her mouth slightly open, and then she shook her head and laughed quietly to herself and said, "You are absolutely insane, Kong Tae, and I am both terrified and impressed by you, instructor." Vel continued his briefing at the front of the hall and explained in great detail that the jungle, Unavareth 7, was officially classified as one of the most dangerous training grounds in the entire galaxy, and the reasons for this classification were numerous and terrifying. "Atmosphere in the low valleys is toxic," he said, "and exposure to the gases will kill you within minutes if you are not careful, and the predators in every biome are deadly and fast and always hungry for fresh meat." He paused and let his words sink in, and several cadets made sounds of distress. "The Vareth stalkers are the apex predators of the moon," he continued, "and they are pack hunters that work together with terrifying coordination, and they can smell blood from 10 kilometers away, and they hunt primarily at night when you cannot see them coming until it is too late." More panic spread through the assembled cadets like a wave, and Rico the Tesserae, who had asked about the failure rate with such confidence, suddenly did not look so confident anymore, and his scales had turned a noticeably paler shade of green, which indicated fear in his species. "You are overwhelmed by the conditions," Vel continued in his rumbling voice, "and you decide to signal for extraction, then you will be rescued by our shuttles, but you will automatically fail the exam, and you will not graduate from the academy this year, and you will have to wait another full cycle to attempt the examination." Again he paused again and looked around the room with those piercing yellow eyes, and then he said in a quieter but somehow more frightening tone, "Some of you will choose not to signal for extraction, even when you should, and some of you will die out there on that moon, and that is the reality of this examination, and I will not pretend otherwise." Day stretched his arms above his head again and cracked his knuckles, and looked at him like he had completely lost his mind. At night, after the briefing was finished, the cadets were given time to prepare mentally for the exam that would begin in the morning, and most of them spent the hours pacing back and forth in their small quarters, or praying to whatever gods their species believed in, or crying quietly in corners where they thought no one could see. Tay went to the academy library. He sat down at a computer terminal in a quiet corner of the massive room filled with knowledge from 1,000 worlds, and he pulled up every file he could find on Varith 7, and he read about the wildlife and the plant life and the geography and the climate patterns, and he took careful notes in his head because he had always had a very good memory for details. The jungle moon had 3 main biomes according to the files, and the first was the dense lowland jungle, where the toxic valleys were located, and the second was the highland forest, where the air was cleaner, but the predators were significantly larger and more aggressive, and the third was the Rocky Mountain region, where temperatures dropped below freezing at night and survival required finding shelter quickly. Tay noted with great interest that the lowland jungle had iron ore deposits near the river systems, where the water had eroded the rock over millions of years, and he noted that the highland forest had clay-rich soil that would be perfect for certain purposes, and he noted that the mountain region had deposits of flint and obsidian that could be useful. He smiled to himself in the quiet library and felt something like excitement building in his chest and earth before he had joined the Galactic Military Exchange Program. Tay had worked as a wilderness survival instructor for 6 years, and he had spent countless hours teaching people how to survive in deserts and jungles, in frozen wastelands and swamps with nothing but their wits and their hands and maybe a knife if they were lucky. This exam was supposed to last 72 hours, and that was supposed to be a challenge. Tay was already planning what he would do. After the first 12 hours, once he had the basics of survival secured, the next morning came quickly, and all 300 cadets were loaded onto massive dropships that would carry them to the jungle moon, and Tay sat quietly in his assigned AMD seat while the alien cadets around him trembled and sweated and made strange sounds of distress that varied depending on their species. A Makari cadet, with blue skin and 6 eyes that blinked independently of each other, leaned over to Tay from the seat next to him and spoke in a shaking voice. "Human, are you not afraid of what awaits us on that moon?" he asked. Tay looked at him with calm, dark eyes and said simply, "Afraid of what exactly?" The Makari stared at him with all 6 of his eyes and could not find any words to respond, and eventually he just turned away and went back to trembling quietly. Dropships flew for 2 hours through the black emptiness of space, and then they entered the atmosphere of Varith 7, and the whole vessel began to shake and rattle violently, and the cadets held onto their seats with desperate grips and screamed as the ship was buffeted by turbulent winds. Tay closed his eyes and took a comfortable nap. When the ship finally stopped shaking, a mechanical voice announced over the speakers that individual drop pods were now being prepared for deployment, and one by one, the cadets were loaded into small metal capsules, barely big enough for a single person, and fired down toward the surface of the jungle moon like bullets. From Agunte climbed into his assigned pod, and the door sealed behind him with a hiss of pressurized air, and he felt the sudden violent jolt of acceleration as he was launched toward the planet below at incredible speed. Pods screamed through the atmosphere of Varith 7 in the heat. Shields on the outside glowed red and then orange and then bright yellow with the friction of re-entry, and the temperature inside the pod rose uncomfortably, and Tay sweated but remained. Then the parachutes deployed with a jarring snap, and the pod slowed dramatically and began drifting down through the thick canopy of alien trees and crashed through branches and leaves before landing hard on the jungle floor with an impact that rattled Tay bones. The door of the pod blew open with an explosive charge, and Tay stepped out into the thick, humid air of Varith 7, and he took a deep breath and smelled the rich, organic scent of the jungle and looked around at the dense green vegetation that surrounded him on all sides like walls of a living maze. The sounds of the jungle were loud and strange, and there were clicking insects and screaming birds and the distant rumble of something very large moving through the underbrush somewhere far away. Tay pulled his standard-issue survival knife from his belt and looked at it with a critical eye and frowned with disappointment. "This will not do at all," he said quietly to himself, "and I will need much better tools than this." He began walking into the jungle with confident steps for the first hour of his time on Varith 7. Tay moved through the dense vegetation with careful, deliberate steps, and he observed everything around him with the trained eye of someone who had spent years learning to read wilderness environments. He noted the types of plants he passed, and which ones might be edible, and which ones might be poisonous. And he noted the tracks of various animals pressed into the soft earth, and he noted the direction of water flow in the small streams he crossed. He found a larger stream after 90 minutes of walking, and the water was clear and cold, and there were strange fish with many fins swimming in the shallows, and on the banks of the stream he found exactly what he had been hoping to find: iron ore deposits. The reddish-brown stones were scattered along the waterline, where the current had washed them down from somewhere upstream, and Tay picked one up and felt its weight in his hand and nodded with satisfaction at the quality of the ore. Then he looked at the soil near the bank and dug his fingers into the dark earth and found that it was heavy with iron content, which would be perfect for making molds and building structures. He had everything he would need. While Tay was examining rocks and dirt and planning his projects, the other cadets scattered across the moon were fighting desperately for their lives and screaming in terror and running from shadows and climbing trees to escape predators that hunted them through the darkness. Rico, the Tisari, who had asked about the failure rate with such confidence, had landed in one of the valley regions. In the air there was thick with toxic fumes that burned his lungs, and he was coughing and choking and stumbling toward higher ground with tears streaming from his reptilian eyes and leaving trails down his pale green scales. A Makari cadet with blue skin had already activated her emergency beacon and signaled for extraction after a Varith stalker had chased her for 3 kilometers through the jungle. She was sobbing uncontrollably when the rescue shuttle finally arrived to pick her up and take her back to the academy in failure. But Tay was not running from anything. He spent the afternoon hours gathering materials from the jungle around him, and he collected stones of various sizes and shapes and branches of different thicknesses and lengths and vines that could be used for binding, and large leaves that could provide shelter from rain. He found a small clearing near the stream where the ground was flat and dry, and the trees provided some protection from the wind. And he decided that this would be his camp for the duration of the exam. He built a fire first using techniques he had learned in the mountains of Earth many years ago. He created a fire bough from a curved branch and a straight stick and some dried moss that he had gathered from the shady side of the trees, and within 15 minutes he had a small flame burning in a ring of stones that he had arranged in a circle. Then he built a shelter that would keep him safe and dry through the night. He cut branches with his knife and lashed them together with vines in a framework that would support his weight off the ground, and he created a raised platform that would keep him away from insects and small predators and flooding if it rained, and he covered the platform with large waxy leaves that would shed water by the time the sun began to set and paint the jungle in shades of orange and red and purple. Tay had a fire burning steadily and a shelter built solidly, and he was sitting by the stream catching fish with a spear he had made from a sharpened branch. He cooked 2 of the strange multifinned fish over his fire and ate them slowly and savored the taste and watched the jungle grow dark around him as night fell on Varith 7 back at the academy. The observation deck was filled with instructors and cadets who had not been selected for the exam, and they were watching the live feeds from thousands of tiny cameras that had been placed all over the jungle. Moonyuna stood near the front of the crowded room, and she watched the screen that showed Tay sitting calmly by his fire eating fish, and she could not believe what her eyes were showing her. "He looks like he is on vacation," she said to herself in amazement, "and like this is some kind of camping trip instead of a deadly survival exam." Instructor Vel stood behind her with his forearms crossed over his broad chest, and his yellow eyes were fixed on the screen showing the human, and he did not say anything, but his expression was deeply troubled. Rico, who had failed the exam on the first day and been rescued from the toxic valley, was standing in the corner of the observation deck with a thermal blanket wrapped around his shoulders, and he was watching the screens with anger and confusion burning in his reptilian eyes. "How is the human so calm?" he demanded in a harsh, bitter voice, and why is he not struggling like everyone else? No one answered him, because no one had an answer to give on the screen. Tay finished his meal and threw the fish bones into the stream, and then he stretched his arms above his head and yawned and climbed onto his shelter platform and lay down on his back. Jungle around him was filled with terrifying sounds, and the roars of distant predators, and the screams of dying animals, and the rustle of dangerous things moving. The darkness and hunting for prey. Tay closed his eyes and fell asleep within minutes, as if he was lying in a comfortable bed in a safe room instead of on a wooden platform in one of the most dangerous jungles in the galaxy. Yuna laughed out loud, and the aliens around her stared at her with confusion, and she just shook her head and said, "You all have absolutely no idea what you are dealing with when it comes to humans, instructor." Vel finally spoke, and his deep voice was quiet and serious, and filled with something that might have been concern. "What do you mean by that?" he asked. Harriana looked at him and smiled and said, "Humans spent 200,000 years as the apex predators of Earth, and we evolved on a planet that was constantly trying to kill us, and we did not become apex predators by running away and hiding from danger." She pointed at the screen where Tay was sleeping peacefully in the middle of one of the most dangerous jungles in the entire galaxy. "That man is not just surviving this exam," she said with pride in her voice, "and he is getting comfortable and making himself at home." Looked at the screen and felt something he had not felt in a very long time during his career as an instructor at this academy. He felt genuine fear the first night on Vareth 7. Passed slowly for most of the cadets who huddled in trees and caves and prayed for morning to come, but it passed quickly for one human who slept better than he had slept in months and in his dreams. Kong Tay saw iron and fire in the shapes of tools and weapons waiting to be born from raw materials, and he smiled in his sleep because tomorrow he would begin his real work on this moon. The jungle was quiet around his camp, as if even the predators sensed that there was something different about this particular prey, and something that made them hesitate to approach them. Stars wheeled overhead in unfamiliar patterns, and the moons of Vareth 7 cast strange shadows through the canopy, and somewhere in the darkness of Varath, Stalker raised its head and sniffed the air and smelled something it had never smelled before. It smelled a human, and it did not know yet that it should be afraid. The sun rose over Vareth 7 and painted the jungle in brilliant shades of gold and green, and the morning mist curled through the trees like ghostly fingers. And Kang Tay opened his eyes and stretched his body and felt completely refreshed after what had been the best sleep he had gotten in many weeks. He climbed down from his shelter platform with easy practiced movements and walked to the stream and knelt at the edge and washed his face in the cold, clear water and drank deeply and felt the coolness spread through his body and wake him up fully. Then he stood and looked around at his camp with a critical, evaluating eye and considered what he had accomplished so far and what still needed to be done. The shelter was good and solid, but it could be improved with additional reinforcement, and the fire had died down to glowing embers overnight, but that was fine because he could easily restart it, and the fish were still swimming in the stream. So food would not be a problem for the foreseeable future, but the knife was definitely a problem. Tay pulled the standard issue survival knife from his belt and looked at it with open disappointment on his face, and it was a simple blade, about 20 centimeters long with a plain handle wrapped in synthetic material, and it was adequate for cutting vines and skinning small animals, but it was absolutely not adequate for what Tay had planned to accomplish during this exam. He needed better tools than this cheap academy issue blade. He needed weapons that could actually protect him. He needed a forge back. At the academy observation deck, the morning shift of instructors and cadets had arrived to take over, watching the live feeds from Vareth 7, and the screens showed cadets all across the moon in various states of distress and desperation and fear. One cadet had clearly not slept at all during the night and was hiding in a tall tree with wide, terrified eyes that darted back and forth watching for predators, and another cadet was trying to eat some berries that she had found that would almost certainly make her violently sick, and another cadet was crying quietly in a dark cave and rocking back and forth. But the screen showing Kong Tay showed something completely different from all of this suffering, though. Human was walking calmly along the stream and collecting reddish colored stones and piling them in a neat stack near his camp, and he was humming. Attuned to himself, and he looked like a man who was enjoying a pleasant morning walk through a park rather than surviving a deadly. Examination instructor Vel arrived on the observation deck 5 minutes after the morning shift began, and his uniform was properly buttoned this time, but his yellow eyes were bleary with exhaustion because he had not slept well after what he had witnessed the day before. He walked directly to the screen showing the human and stared at it without blinking. "What is he doing now?" he asked, in a tired voice. A junior instructor, standing nearby, checked her data pad and scrolled through the information and said, "He appears to be collecting iron ore deposits from the stream beds, sir, and he has been doing this for approximately 1 hour now." Vel turned slowly to look at her and said, "Iron ore," and his voice was completely flat with disbelief. "Sir," she confirmed, "and the geological scans confirm that the stones he is collecting have high iron content." Vel looked back at the screen and watched as Tay carried another armload of reddish stones to the growing pile near his camp, and the pile was already quite large and impressively organized, and the human showed absolutely no signs of stopping his collection efforts. Why in the galaxy would he need iron? Or Vel asked, but no one in the observation deck could provide him with an answer. The surface of Varith 7 Tay had finished collecting all the ore he would need, and now he was digging into the clarage soil near the stream bank with his hands and pulling up handfuls of the dense gray material and forming it into rectangular bricks that he set out in a sunny spot to dry. He worked with the steady, practiced hands of someone who had done this exact thing many times before in many different places, and his movements were efficient and confident and almost mechanical in their precision. He built a structure out of stones and clay over the next 3 hours. When he was finally finished, was a small dome-shaped construction about 1/2 meter tall, with an opening at the front large enough to insert materials and a hole at the top to allow smoke and gases to escape it. It was a furnace, a primitive but functional furnace that would allow him to heat materials to extremely high temperature. Sienna arrived on the observation deck just as Tay was putting the finishing touches on his furnace, and she pushed through the crowd of confused aliens to get to the front where she could see the screen clearly, and when she saw what the human had built, she started laughing with pure joy. "He is building a forge," she said, and her voice was filled with amazement and admiration and pride in her fellow human. The aliens around her stared at her with blank expressions and then stared at the screen and then looked back at her, because they clearly did not understand what they were seeing or why it was significant. If forge, one of them finally asked, "And what exactly is a forge and why would anyone need one during a survival examination?" Una turned to face the crowd of confused aliens, and she explained in simple terms that a forge was a place where humans heated metal until it became soft and malleable and then shaped it into tools and weapons using hammers and anvils, and that humans had been doing this for thousands upon thousands of years. "But that is primitive technology," a Tesserae cadet said with dismissiveness in his voice, "and we have matter fabricators and molecular assemblers that can create any tool instantly from raw material." Sienna nodded patiently and said, "Yes, you absolutely do have that technology, but Kung Tay does not have access to a matter fabricator right now, and he only has a knife, and so he is making do with what resources are available to him in this environment." She turned back to the screen and watched as Tay began building something else nearby, and it took her a moment to recognize what he was constructing. "This Tema bellows," she said with wonder in her voice, "and he is building a bellows to pump air into the furnace." Tay had killed a small furry animal earlier that morning with a trap he had set overnight, and he had skinned it carefully with practiced skill, and now he was using the hide to create a device with 2 wooden paddles that would push air through a tube and into his furnace and make the fire burn much hotter than it could burn on its own. On the observation deck, nobody spoke and nobody moved, and everyone just watched in stunned silence as the human worked with calm, efficient movements that suggested complete confidence in what he was doing. Instructor Vel felt his stomach turn with something that he was beginning to recognize as fear by midday. On the second day of the exam, Tay had gathered enough dried wood and kindling to fuel his furnace, and he had built a fire inside the stone and clay structure, and he was using his newly constructed bellows to pump air into the flames with steady Rhythmic pumps. The fire grew hotter and hotter with each pump of the bellows, and soon it was glowing white with intense heat, and the stones of the furnace were radiating warmth that Tay could feel from several meters away. He added the iron ore to the furnace and watched it carefully with experienced eyes, and he knew from years of practice that it would take several hours for the ore to melt properly and separate the pure iron from all the rocky impurities. While he waited for the metal to melt, he prepared other materials that he would need for the next phase of his work. He found stones that would work as a hammer and as an anvil, and he selected them carefully based on their shape and hardness and weight. And he gathered more clay to make molds for casting, and he sharpened sticks that would serve as makeshift tongs for handling. Hot Metaluna watched all of this unfold on the screen with pride swelling in her heart. And she remembered learning about the history of human civilization in school and how their ancient ancestors had discovered the secrets of metalworking, and how that single discovery changed absolutely everything about human society and capability. Humans had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of taking rocks from the ground and transforming them through fire and force into tools that could cut and kill and build and and now Kang Tay was doing exactly the same thing on an alien moon millions of light years from Earth. Using nothing but the knowledge in his head and the strength in his hands, Makari Cadet, standing next to Yuna, spoke in a trembling voice and said, "This is simply not possible, and this has never happened before, and no cadet has ever attempted tool creation during the survival examination in the entire history of this academe." Anna looked at him with calm, confident eyes and said, "No cadet except a human." The hours passed slowly on the observation deck as everyone watched the screen with growing disbelief, and the sun moved across the sky of Vera 7, and TA tended his furnace with patience and skill, and occasionally added more fuel or pumped the bellows to maintain the intense temperature. Finally, after nearly 4 hours of heating, TA looked into the furnace and saw that the iron had melted into a glowing pool at the bottom and had separated from the slag and impurities, and he nodded with satisfaction at a job well done. He used his makeshift wooden tongs to carefully pull a glowing lump of molten iron from the furnace, and the metal was bright orange and yellow with heat, and it dripped slightly as he transferred it to his stone anvil. Then he picked up his stone hammer and began to work. The sound of metal being shaped by powerful hammer blows echoed through the jungle, and birds flew away from nearby trees in alarm, and predators in the surrounding area stopped what they were doing and listened with curiosity and confusion. Worked the iron with focused intensity, and he hammered it flat and then folded it over on itself and hammered it flat again, and then heated it in the furnace once more and folded it again. And this process of folding and hammering would make the metal stronger and more durable. He worked for 2 straight hours without stopping, and sweat poured down his face, and his arms burned with the effort. Blocked out everything except the metal and the hammer, and the anvil's lowly the shapeless lump of iron transformed under his skilled hands and became something recognizable and something useful. Blade by the time the sun began to set on the second day, Tay had finished his first weapon, and he held it up to the fading light and examined his work with a critical eye. It was a short sword approximately 50 centimeters, long, with a straight blade and a wrapped handle made from braided vines and leather strips cut from the animal hide he had used. For the bellows, it was not a beautiful weapon, and it would not win any awards for craftsmanship, and the blade was slightly uneven in places where his makeshift tools had not allowed for perfect control. But it was sharp, and it was strong, and it was far, far better than the standard survival knife that the Academy had given him. He tested the edge against his thumb and nodded with satisfaction when it drew a thin line of blood with minimal pressure. He was not finished yet. He returned to his furnace and pulled out more molten iron and worked through the night. By the orange light of his fire and the white glow of the hot metal, and he created 2 throwing knives with balanced blades and wrapped handles, and a hand axe with a thick, heavy head, and a set of metal arrowheads that could be attached to wooden shafts. On the observation deck, the night shift had arrived hours ago, and they stood in the same stunned silence as the day shift had. And they watched the human work by firelight, and the glow of the forge illuminated his concentrated face as he hammered and shaped and created tools from raw materials. Instructor Vel had not left his position, and he had been standing in the same spot for nearly 16 hours, and his legs ached, and his eyes were dry and irritated, but he simply could not look away. From what was happening on the screen, he requested that the technical team verify the authenticity of the footage, and they ran it through every analysis program available. They confirmed after extensive testing that it was completely real and had not been edited or manipulated in any way. The human had built a functional forge from raw materials and had created multiple metal weapons in less than a single day. Admiral Oren, the ancient and wise headmaster of the academy, received an urgent notification on his personal communicator in the middle of the night, and he read the message with growing concern. And then he put on his formal robe and walked through the quiet corridors to the observation deck. When he arrived, he saw the massive crowd of instructors and cadets gathered around one particular screen, and he pushed his way through them to the front and looked at what they were all watching with such intensity. Kang Tae was sitting calmly by his fire and using a smooth stone to sharpen the edge of his newly forged sword, and around him lay the other weapons he had created. And his camp looked less like a survival shelter and more like a small settlement. What exactly am I looking at? Oren asked in his quiet, measured voice. Velov turned to face him, and his expression was deeply troubled, and his forearms were trembling slightly as he spoke this. Human cadet has constructed a working forge from raw materials and has created multiple functional metal weapons, he said. And he has accomplished all of this in approximately 18 hours. Oren was silent for a very long moment as he processed this information, and then he asked a simple question: is any of this against the rules of the examination? Vel checked his datapad and reviewed the official examination guidelines, and then shook his head slowly. No, sir, he said, and the rules clearly state that cadets may use any and all resources available to them on the planet's surface. Oren nodded slowly and looked back at the screen and watched as the human tested the edge of his blade against his thumb, and then nodded with obvious satisfaction at the sharpness contact. The xenobiology department immediately, Oren said, in a voice that allowed for no argument, and tell them that I want a complete briefing on human evolutionary history delivered to my office by morning. Yes, sir, Vel said, and hurried away to make the call. Oren remained standing in front of the screen and watched the human organize his weapons neatly beside his shelter, and then lie down on his sleeping platform and close his eyes. What are you, Oren? Whispered to the image of the sleeping human. And what else are you capable of doing, though? Question hung in the air unanswered, and Vareth 7 Tae finished organizing his weapons and lay down on his comfortable platform and closed his eyes and let sleep take him quickly, because he had worked hard and earned his rest. He had accomplished a great deal today, but tomorrow he planned to accomplish even more as he drifted off to sleep in his jungle camp, surrounded by the weapons he had forged with his own hands. He heard the distant howl of a Vareth stalker somewhere in the darkness, and instead of feeling fear, he smiled. Tomorrow, he thought to himself, and tomorrow I will meet them, and we will see who is really the predator on this moon. The howl came again, closer, this time and somewhere. In the shadows, yellow eyes watched the human camp, and the strange fire, and the glint of metal. The stalkers had found something interesting, and they would be back. The second night on Vareth 7 was darker than the first had been, and the moons of the jungle world had shifted their positions behind thick, heavy clouds, and the jungle was filled with shadows, so deep that even the keenest eyes could barely penetrate them. Kang Tae woke suddenly in the middle of the night because he heard something moving at the edge of his camp, and the sound was subtle, but his trained ears had caught it immediately. Did not panic, and he did not jump up and grab his weapons, and he did not make any sudden movements that might trigger a predator response from whatever was watching. Instead, he simply opened his eyes slowly and lay perfectly still on his shelter platform and listened with complete attention to the sounds of the jungle around him. The sound came again, and it was a soft padding of large feet on the jungle floor, and it was accompanied by the low, controlled breathing of something that was used to hunting silently, and the distinctive click of sharp claws on stone. Everoth stalkers had come to investigate his camp. Tae sat up slowly and carefully and looked toward the edge of the firelight that still flickered from the embers of his forge fire, and there in the darkness just beyond where the light could reach, he saw 3 pairs of glowing yellow eyes watching him with intensity. The eyes did not blink and they did not look away, and they studied him with a combination of hunger and something that might have been curiosity. The stalkers were larger than Tay had expected, and each one was approximately 2 meters long from their blunt noses to the tips of their muscular tails, and they had sleek black fur that seemed to absorb the light and powerful legs that were clearly built for running and chasing and catching. Prayed their mouths were closed, but Tay knew from his research that those mouths were filled with teeth that had evolved specifically for tearing flesh from. Boney and other cadet on this moon would have screamed in terror at this sight, or run blindly into the jungle hoping to escape, or frozen, completely unable to move, while the predators closed in for the kill. Tay looked at them with calm, dark eyes and said in a quiet, conversational tone, "Hello? There the stalkers did not attack, and they did not retreat back into the shadows. They simply continued to watch him with those glowing yellow eyes that reflected the dying firelight." Tay noted several important things about their behavior. In the few seconds after he spoke, he noted that they were staying at the edge of the firelight and seemed reluctant to enter the illuminated area around his camp. He noted that their body language was more curious than overtly aggressive, and their ears were forward and alert rather than flattened back in preparation for an attack. He noted that the largest one positioned in the center of the group was clearly the alpha of this small pack, and the other 2 were positioned slightly behind it in a subordinate formation. Idea began to form in his mind, and it was an idea that would have seemed completely insane to anyone else but to Tay. It felt like the logical next step in his survival strategy. He picked up a stone from beside his shelter platform and weighed it in his hand for a moment, and then threw it toward the stalkers, but deliberately aimed so that it would land in the dirt a few meters in front of the alpha rather than hitting any of them. The stone landed with a soft thud, and the 3 stalkers flinched backward in surprise, and their ears went flat against their skulls, and they hissed with shock at this unexpected behavior from what they had assumed was prey. But they did not run away. They recovered from their surprise quickly and returned to watching. Tay, with those unblinking yellow eyes, and the alpha took a small step forward, as if to reassert its dominance over the situation. Tay nodded to himself and learned something very important about these creatures from this brief interaction. These predators were not used to being challenged by anything on this moon, and they were accustomed to being the most dangerous things in their environment, and they did not know how to respond appropriately to a prey animal that showed no fear and actively challenged them. He lay back down on his shelter platform and closed his eyes and ignored the 3 deadly predators watching him from the shadows as if they were nothing more than harmless wildlife. After a long, tense moment during which nothing happened, the stalkers retreated silently into the darkness of the jungle, and Tay smiled to himself with satisfaction and went back to sleep on the observation deck in the academy. A junior instructor who had been assigned to watch the night shift feeds let out a small scream of alarm and nearly fell out of her chair when she saw what had happened. She grabbed her communicator with shaking hands and called Instructor Vel, who had finally been convinced to try to sleep in his quarters. And she told him in a panicked voice that he needed to come to the observation deck immediately because something incredible had just happened. Arrive on the observation deck 5 minutes later, with his uniform only half-buttoned and his yellow eyes bleary with interrupted sleep, and he demanded to know what could possibly be so urgent that it required waking him. The junior instructor did not answer with words, and instead she simply played back the recorded footage of Tay and the stalkers. Vel watched with growing disbelief as the humans sat up and calmly observed 3 apex predators that had come to his camp and then threw a rock at them and then lay back down and went to sleep. "He is completely insane," Vel said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "Maybe," the junior instructor said with uncertainty, "but he's also still alive." And the stalkers left without attacking him. Vel stood in front of the screen and watched the replay again, and then watched it a 3rd time, and he felt that cold sensation of fear returning to his chest with even greater intensity than before. The sun rose on the 2nd full day of the survival exam, and Tay woke feeling refreshed and energized and ready to continue His work on this jungle moon, he climbed down from his platform and went about his morning routine and washed in the stream, and ate some dried fish that he had smoked the day before and checked all of his weapons to make sure they were in good condition then. He set out into the jungle with his sword on his hip and his axe in his hand and a specific purpose in his mind. He was going hunting, but not for food and not for materials. He was hunting for information to move through the jungle with careful, silent steps that barely disturbed the leaves on the ground, and he followed the tracks that the Vareth stalkers had left when they visited his camp the night before. The tracks were clear in the soft earth and led deeper into the forest, where the trees grew thicker and older, and the canopy blocked out more of the sunlight, and the shadows grew darker and more numerous. He followed the tracks for 2 hours, and eventually they led him to a small clearing in the dense forest where the stalker pack had made there. Then he found what he was looking for. A pack of 3 stalkers was resting in the clearing, and they were lying in the shade of a massive fallen tree, and the alpha was in the center with its large head resting on its front paws, while the other 2 pack members lay nearby in relaxed positions. They had not detected his presence yet because he had approached from downwind and was hidden in the shadows of the surrounding trees. Tay climbed carefully and quietly into a large tree at the edge of the clearing and found a comfortable branch where he could observe the pack without being seen, and he settled in to watch them for as long as necessary. He watched them for hours without moving. He watched how they interacted with each other and how the alpha always ate first when they woke and shared a cached kill, and how the other 2 waited patiently for permission to approach the food. He watched how they communicated with each other using low growls and subtle body movements and ear positions and tail positions that conveyed different meanings. He watched as they woke from their rest and stretched their powerful bodies and began to move through the jungle in search of prey. He followed them at a careful distance as they tracked a herd of small, deer-like creatures through the dense undergrowth, and he observed their hunting techniques and their coordination and their patience. The hunt, when it finally happened, was fast and brutal and terrifyingly efficient. The stalkers worked together with practiced coordination that suggested they had hunted as a pack for many years, and they drove 2 of the deer creatures away from the main herd and cornered them against a rocky outcrop and killed them, both in less than 5 minutes, to watch the alpha eat first, while the others waited, and he watched the alpha finish eating its share and give a low rumbling growl that signaled permission for the subordinates to approach and begin eating. He understood the hierarchy of the pack now, and he understood what he would need to do to become part of Ith. Returned to his camp with a detailed plan forming in his mind. Back at the academy, Admiral Oren was sitting in a conference room with 4 professors from the xenobiology department, and they were presenting their research on human evolutionary history using holographic displays and detailed charts. The lead professor was a thin Makari with pale blue skin and 8 eyes that moved independently as she spoke, and she was displaying images of Earth and its diverse and dangerous ecosystems humans evolved on a planet called Earth, which is located in a star system near the outer edge of the galaxy. She explained, and they developed as pursuit predators on a world that was filled with dangerous megafauna and challenging environmental conditions. She showed images of ancient Earth with its ice ages and its volcanic periods and its mass extinction events, and she explained that humans had survived all of these challenges through adaptation and cooperation and tool use. What makes humans particularly unusual, she continued, and is that they have no natural weapons built into their bodies, like claws or fangs, and they have no natural armor like scales or thick hide, and they have no venom or poison gland. She paused and looked at Admiral Oren with her 8 eyes. Instead of these biological advantages, she said, and humans developed intelligence and endurance and an absolutely unmatched ability to adapt to any environment they encounter. She showed images of ancient humans hunting woolly mammoths with spears and building fires in caves and crafting tools from stone and bone, and she explained that humans had spread across their entire planet by using these abilities to overcome every obstacle they encountered. They are not the strongest species in the galaxy, the professor said, and they are not the fastest, and they are not the most heavily armed with natural weapons. She paused again for emphasis, but they may be the most relentless species we have ever encountered, and when they face a problem, they do not give up, and they do not accept defeat, and they simply keep trying different approaches until they find a solution that works. Admiral Oren listened to all of this with growing unease in his chest, and when the presentation was finally finished, he thanked the professors and dismissed them and sat alone in the conference room for a very long time. Then he stood and walked back to the observation deck to watch what the human would do next. Varith 7, the afternoon sun, was hot and bright, and Tay was preparing for the next phase of his plan to integrate himself into the stalker pack. He had spent the past several hours hunting with his forged weapons, and he had successfully killed a Gronth, which was a massive herbivore approximately the size of a large earth cow with thick gray hide and curving tusket. Had taken him 2 hours to track the Granth through the jungle, and another hour to kill it using a combination of pit traps and his forged sword, and the hunt had been challenging but ultimately successful. Now the Gronth carcass was lying in a clearing near his camp, and Tay was sitting calmly beside it on a fallen log and eating a small portion of the meat that he had cut from the haunch and cooked over a small fire. The rest of the massive carcass remained untouched, and the smell of fresh blood and raw meat was spreading through the jungle on the warm afternoon breeze. Tay knew that the stalkers would smell it, and he knew that they would come to investigate, and he knew exactly what he was going to do when they arrived. He did not have to wait very long, though. 3 pairs of glowing yellow eyes appeared at the edge of the clearing approximately 30 minutes after Tay had settled into his position, and the stalkers approached slowly and cautiously, with their ears forward and their noses twitching at the overwhelming scent of fresh meat. Tay did not move from his position on the log, and he did not reach for his weapons that were lying beside him, and he simply continued eating his small portion of cooked meat and watching the stalkers with calm, steady eyes. Alpha stalker stopped at the edge of the clearing and watched the human with obvious confusion in its yellow eyes. This was not how prey was supposed to behave. At all, prey was supposed to run and scream and fight desperately against the inevitable, and then to prey. Was not supposed to sit calmly beside a massive kill and eat while 3 apex predators approached. With clear, hungry intent, the alpha took another step forward and growled low in its powerful throat, and it was clearly trying to intimidate the human and establish dominance over both the kill and the situation. Tay looked up at the alpha and met its eyes directly without flinching or looking away, and he made a low rumbling sound in his own throat that was not quite a growl, but was definitely not a sound of submission or fear. Alpha stopped its advance, and its ears went back slightly, and it was confused by this response that did not fit into any category of behavior it had ever encountered before. It returned to eating his meal and continued to ignore the stalkers completely, as if they were beneath his notice. The minutes stretched into an hour, and the standoff continued with neither side willing to make the first move. The other 2 stalkers looked at the alpha for guidance and direction, but the alpha had no guidance to give because it had never faced a situation like this in its entire life as a hunter. Finally, Tay finished eating his portion of the Gronth meat, and he stood up from the log and stretched his arms and walked away from the carcass and returned to his camp without ever once looking back at the stalkers. 3 predators watched him go with complete bewilderment, and then they approached the abandoned carcass and began to eat. The observation deck, every single person was absolutely silent, and Instructor Vel had his 4 hands pressed flat against the screen, as if he could somehow reach through it and shake the human and demand to know what he thought he was doing. What is happening? Vel demanded. And why did he leave the kill for them? And what is his strategy? Haruna was standing nearby, and she had been watching with a knowing smile on her face throughout the entire encounter, and now she spoke up with confidence in her voice. He is establishing a relationship with them, she explained, and a relationship that will benefit him far more than simply killing them. Woodvell turned to look at her, and his expression was desperate for any kind of understanding that would make sense of what he had witnessed. Explain this to me, he demanded, and explain it in terms that I can understand. Yuna walked closer to the screen and pointed at the stalkers who were now happily eating the Gronth meat that the human had provided for them. He is showing them that he is not prey, she said, and that is the first and most important lesson. She moved her finger to point at the pile of meat that remained. He is showing them that he has access to resources that they want, she continued, and that he is capable of obtaining food that they cannot easily obtain on their own. Shay looked at Vel with a smile that was both proud and slightly frightening, and most importantly, she said, and he is showing them that he is not afraid of them at all and that their usual intimidation tactics have absolutely no effect on him. Vel looked back at the screen and then at Admiral Oren, who had arrived and was standing in the shadows at the back of the observation deck with a deeply troubled expression on his ancient face. Oren stepped forward and spoke in a quiet voice that somehow carried through the entire room. Humans domesticated wolves on thousands of years ago, he said, and they took wild apex predators that hunted in packs, and they turned them into loyal companions that would fight and die for their human masters. He looked at the screen where Tay was calmly preparing for sleep, while 3 deadly killers ate the food he had generously provided for them. I believe, Oren said, and that this human is attempting to do exactly the same thing here with these Vareth stalkers. Room fell completely silent as everyone processed the implications of what the Admiral had just said on Vareth 7. Tay lay down on his shelter platform and closed his eyes and smiled to himself. In the darkness tomorrow, he would take the next step, and the day after that, he would take another step, and eventually these magnificent predators would follow him willingly, because that was what humans did. They took the wild and the dangerous and the deadly, and they made it their own. The third morning on Vareth 7 arrived with a thick mist rolling through the jungle and curling around the trees like a living thing, and Kang Tay woke from a deep, peaceful sleep to discover something remarkable. The stalkers had not left his camp during the night. They were lying at the edge of his cleared area, approximately 20 meters from his shelter platform, and they were watching him with those glowing yellow eyes that had begun to look less hungry and more curious with each passing day. They climbed down from his platform slowly and deliberately and made no sudden movements that might startle the predators, and he walked to the stream and knelt at the edge and washed his face in the cold water. The stalkers watched him, but they did not move from their resting positions, built up his fire from the embers that remained from the night before, and added more wood until the flames were crackling warmly, and he cooked some fish that he had caught in a trap he had set in the stream. The stalkers watched him, but they did not approach. He checked his weapons and organized his supplies and walked around his camp inspecting everything he had built. Over the past 2 days, the stalkers watched him like he was the most fascinating thing they had ever encountered in their entire lives as hunters on this jungle. Moontae smiled to himself because he knew that his plan was working exactly as he had hoped it would in the observation deck at the academy. The morning shift arrived to a state of chaos and confusion that was unusual even for the strange events of the past few days. Everyone was talking over each other and pointing at the screens and asking questions that nobody seemed able to answer. The stalkers did not leave the human camp overnight, a junior instructor reported too. Vel, when he arrived, looking even more exhausted than he had the day before, and they had been lying near his shelter for approximately 6 hours without showing any aggressive behavior. Instructor Vel rubbed his yellow eyes with 2 of his forehands and stared at the screen with an expression of complete bewilderment. Why? He asked in a tired, frustrated voice, and why are they staying near him instead of hunting or returning to their deno? One had an answer that made any sense. Admiral Oren arrived shortly after Vel and pushed his way through the crowd to the front of the observation deck and looked at the screen showing Tay and the 3 stalkers resting peacefully near his camp. Have they made any attempt to attack him? Oren asked. No, sir, Vel reported, and they have not made any aggressive moves toward him at all since the encounter last night when he gave them the Gronth carcass. Ian nodded slowly, and his ancient eyes were thoughtful and calculating. We continue to observe and learn, he said, and this may be the most valuable data we have ever collected about human behavior and capabilities on the surface of Vareth 7. Tay finished his morning routine and decided that it was time to take the next step in his relationship with the stalker pack. He picked up his axe and his sword and walked out of his camp and moved toward the jungle, and as he passed within 10 meters of where the stalkers were lying, he did not look at them, and he did not acknowledge their presence in any way. He simply walked past them as if they were not there, At all, he disappeared into the dense vegetation and began tracking another Granth for his next hunt, and the stalkers rose from their resting positions and followed him at a careful distance. Day tended not to notice them following him, but inside he was pleased that his strategy was producing results. He found Granth tracks after an hour of careful searching, and he followed them deeper into the jungle, and he moved with the quiet, deliberate steps of a predator stalking at its prey. And behind him, the stalkers matched his pace and followed his path. When he found the Granth grazing in a small meadow, he did not attack immediately, even though he had a clear opportunity instead. He studied the terrain around the meadow and identified the best approach angles and noted where the animal would likely run if startled, and then he set a simple but effective trap using vines and sharp wooden stakes concealed in a pit. He drove the Granth toward the trap by throwing stones and making noise, and the massive animal panicked and ran in exactly the direction Tay had predicted, and it fell into the pit and impaled itself on the stakes. Tay moved in quickly with his sword and ended the creature's suffering with a single clean strike to the neck. He stepped back from the carcass and looked around at the jungle, and the three stalkers were watching him from the shadows of the trees with expressions that might have been respect or admiration. Cut a portion of the Granth meat for himself, and then walked away from the kill, and sat down on a fallen log approximately 10 meters from the carcass. The stalkers approached the carcass, but they did not immediately begin eating. They looked at Tay, and then at the kill, and then back at Tay again, and they seemed to be waiting for something. Tay understood exactly what they were waiting for. He made a low rumbling sound in his throat and nodded his head toward the carcass, and it was the same gesture of permission that he had observed the Alpha give to the subordinate pack members when he had watched them hunt the day before. The Alpha stalker stared at him with those intense yellow eyes for a long moment, and something shifted in the depths of those eyes, and something changed in the way the predator looked at this. A strange creature that walked on two legs and carried sharp metal things. Alpha lowered its massive head slightly in a gesture that acknowledged something, and then it turned to the carcass and began to eat the. Tay sat on his log and ate his own portion of cooked meat and watched them with calm, satisfied eyes. He had just been accepted into the hierarchy of the pack, not as prey that was tolerated, and not as a rival alpha that needed to be challenged and defeated. He had been accepted as something entirely new, and something the stalkers had never encountered before in their existence. Had become a provider, a member of the pack who contributed valuable resources and deserved respect and a place in the social order. Back at the academy, the observation deck had grown impossibly crowded as word spread through the entire institution about what was happening on Vareth. 7 cadets and instructors from every department had abandoned their normal duties and come to watch the impossible unfold on the screens, and there were beings of dozens of different species packed into the room. Una stood near the front, and she was explaining to the confused and frightened aliens what they were witnessing. Domesticated wolves approximately 15,000 years ago, she said, and the process happened exactly like what you are seeing right now. She pointed at the screen where Tay was eating his meal, while sitting calmly only 10 meters away from 3 apex predators who were also eating. Our ancestors provided food and protection, and they integrated themselves into pack structures, and they established themselves as valuable members of animal social groups. She looked around at the gathered aliens and saw fear and confusion and wonder on their faces over many generations. She continued, and the wolves became dogs, and they became loyal companions who would hunt alongside humans and protect human families, and eventually they became so integrated into human society that they could not survive without USA. Tassari cadet spoke up with disbelief in his voice and said, "But that process took thousands of years and generations of breeding, and this human has accomplished something similar in only." Today Sienna smiled, and her smile was not entirely reassuring. "Humans are very fast learners," she said, "and we have had a lot of practice at this sort of thing." Instructor Vel was pacing back and forth at the edge of the observation deck, and his forearms were waving with obvious agitation, and he was muttering to himself about needing to rewrite the entire survival examination manual. Orin stood quietly in the corner and watched the screen and thought deeply about what all of this meant for the future of the academy and the future of galactic relations with the human species. Other species in the galaxy had always looked at humans as newcomers to the cosmic stage and primitives who had only recently discovered space travel and late arrivals, who had much to learn from the older and more established civilizations. Had observed that humans had no natural weapons and no protective armor and no biological advantages that made them obvious threats. But now, Orin was beginning to understand that everyone had been looking at humans in completely the wrong way. Humans were not primitives, and they were not weaklings, and they were certainly not harmless. They were something far more dangerous than any species with claws or fangs or venom. They were adapters. They took whatever environment they found themselves in, and they reshaped it to suit their needs, and they took whatever resources were available, and they transformed them into tools, and they took whatever challenges they faced, and they found ways to overcome them in. Apparently they even took apex predators and turned them into companions in Varith 7. The afternoon sun was high and hot, and Tay led his new pack back toward his camp through the dense jungle. The stalkers followed him willingly now, and they stayed close to him and matched his pace. And they no longer watched him with hunger in their eyes. When they reached the camp, the stalkers lay down in the shade at the edge of the clearing, and they watched Tay with calm, trusting expressions that would have seemed impossible just 2 days earlier. Tay spent the afternoon making improvements to his camp and expanding his living space. He built a smoking rack from wooden poles and vines that would allow him to preserve meat for longer periods, and he created clay pots of various sizes for storing water and cooking food, and he reinforced his shelter with additional support beams and a better roof covering the stalkers. Watched him work with obvious fascination, and occasionally one of them would stand up and approach to sniff at whatever project he was currently working on, and Tay would let them investigate for a moment and then gently push them away when they got too close to his fire or his tools. By evening, the camp looked significantly different than it had that morning. It looked less like a temporary survival shelter that someone had thrown together in desperation, and more like a permanent settlement that someone intended to occupy for a long time. Tay sat by his fire and cooked a meal, and the stalkers lay nearby in comfortable positions, and the jungle around them was unusually quiet because every other predator in the area had sensed that something was different about this particular clearing. Something dangerous had claimed this territory, and something that other predators should avoid. He looked at the alpha stalker, who was lying closest to him, and said in a conversational tone, "You need a name if we are going to be traveling together." Stalker lifted its massive head and looked at him, and tilted its head slightly in a gesture that seemed almost questioning. Tay thought for a moment about what name would be appropriate, and then he smiled and said Bodit was a Korean word that meant ocean, and Tay had always liked the sound of it and the way it rolled off the tongue. The stalker, who was now named Bada, seemed to accept this designation and put its head back down on its paws and closed its yellow eyes. In contentment, Tay looked at the other two stalkers and considered them for a moment. The slightly smaller one, with the distinctive scar on its ear, he named Hanuel, which meant sky, and the third one, with the darker fur, he named Bael, which meant star. The stalkers did not react to their new names, but Tay was satisfied with his choices anyway. In the observation deck, the night shift arrived, and they found that almost no one from the day shift had left to rest. The room was more crowded than it had ever been in the history of the Academy, and every screen was showing feeds from various cadets across the moon, but everyone was watching one particular screen, the screen showing Kang Tay and his 3 tamed predators. Young Akari cadet with blue skin and nervous eyes spoke up and asked a question that was on everyone's mind. Is this even allowed, and is taming the wildlife and using them for protection against the rules of the examination? Instructor Vel turned to look at the young cadet, and his expression suggested that he had been asking himself the same question for hours. He pulled up the official rules of the survival examination on his datapad and read through them very carefully, and then he read through them a second time to make absolutely sure he had not missed anything. After several long minutes of reading, he looked up, and his voice was flat and resigned. The rules state that cadets may use any and all resources available on the planet's surface to survive, he said. He paused and looked at the screen where Tay was now lying on his shelter platform while 3 deadly Vareth stalkers guarded the perimeter of his camp like trained security animals. Apparently, he said in a quiet voice, and apex predators count as available resources. Admiral Doran stepped forward and addressed the gathered crowd with his ancient wise eyes. This changes our understanding of many things, he said, and we believed that we understood human capabilities, but we clearly understood very little. He looked around the observation deck at the faces of cadets and instructors from dozens of different species. Humans do not simply adapt to the environments they encounter, he said, and they actively reshape those environments to serve their needs, and they take existing elements and make them work for human purposes. He looked back at the screen where Tay was sleeping peacefully while Bada kept watch at the edge of the camp, and apparently, he said with something like wonder in his voice, and they accomplished this without even appearing to try very hard. And the jungle moon of Vareth 7 Kong Tay drifted off to sleep, and he was comfortable and safe and well-fed and protected. The survival exam was supposed to last 72 hours and was supposed to test the limits of cadet endurance and capability. 40 hours had now passed, and Tay had essentially already won. He had shelter and food and water and weapons, and now he had protection from the most dangerous predators on the moon. He closed his eyes and let sleep take him, and around him the jungle was quiet, and the stalkers kept careful watch, and the night passed without any incident or danger. The other cadets scattered across the moon were still fighting and struggling and suffering, and some of them would not survive to see the extraction shuttles, but Kong Tay was sleeping peacefully, like a baby with 3 apex predators guarding his dreams. And in the morning he would wake up and wonder what else he could possibly do to pass the time on this moon that had turned out to be so much easier than he had expected. 47 hours into the survival examination, Kong Tay sat beside his fire in the middle of his well-established camp and stared at the dancing flames with an expression that had become increasingly common on his face over the past several hours. He was bored. The jungle around him was quiet and peaceful in a way that it had not been when he first arrived, and the stalkers lay nearby in comfortable positions with their bellies full of the gronth meat from the morning hunt.
Ow.
And their yellow eyes half closed in contentment. Was nothing threatening him, and nothing challenging him, and nothing forcing him to struggle or fight or adapt? He had survived this examination so completely and so thoroughly that there was simply nothing left to do. Sighed heavily and threw another stick into the fire and watched the sparks rise up into the darkening sky above the jungle. Kanapabata lifted his massive head and looked at Tay with what might have been concern in those intelligent yellow eyes, and then the great predator put his head back down on his paws and went back to his rest day, stood up and walked around his camp in a restless circuit and examined everything he had built over the past 2.5 days. The shelter was solid and comfortable and could withstand any storm that this moon could produce, and the forge was functional and had already produced multiple high-quality weapons, and the food storage contained enough smoked meat to last for weeks, and the water collection system provided clean drinking water without requiring trips to the stream. There was nothing that needed to be fixed, and nothing that needed to be improved, and nothing that needed to be done. The restlessness in his chest grew stronger and more insistent. He needed a project, and he needed something to occupy his hands and his mind, and he needed a challenge that would give him purpose. Day looked at the ground near his camp and studied the soil, and an idea began to form in his restless mind. On the observation deck at the observation deck at the academy, the morning of the 3rd day of the exam had arrived, and exhaustion hung heavy over everyone who had been watching the feeds for the past 47 hours. KOs, most of the instructors and cadets had been forced to go to their quarters to sleep at some point during the long hours of observation, but there was always a crowd gathered around the screen showing Kong Tay and his impossible Campuna had barely left the observation deck for the entire duration of the exam, and she had dark circles under her eyes, and her hair was messy and tangled. And she was still smiling. "He looks bored," she said, to no one in particular, and her voice was amused and knowing. Instructor Vel stood beside her, and his 4 arms hung limp at his sides, and he looked like a being who had witnessed too many impossible things and no longer knew how to process new information. Bored, Vel repeated in a flat voice, and he is on one of the most dangerous training moons in the entire galaxy, and he is surrounded by deadly predators and toxic atmospheres and hostile conditions, and he is Boroduna. Nodded and said, "That is actually the most dangerous thing about humans, and when we have nothing to fight against and nothing to overcome, we start looking for things to occupy our time and our energy." The screen, Tay had begun clearing a patch of ground near his camp, and he was using his axe to chop down small trees and remove bushes, and he was turning over the soil with a flat stone that he had shaped into a crude but effective shovel. "What is he doing now?" Vel asked, with resignation in his voice. Una watched the screen for a few moments and studied what the human was building, and then she started laughing with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. "Is starting a garden?" she said, and her voice was filled with wonder. Vel stared at her with all four of his eyes, and then stared at the screen, and then stared at her again. "A garden," he said, and his voice was completely empty of any emotion because he had run out of emotions to feel. "Yes, Una said, and humans have been practicing agriculture for approximately 10,000 years, and it is deeply ingrained in our culture and our instincts." She pointed at the screen where Tay was carefully transplanting edible plants from the surrounding jungle into his newly cleared and prepared plot of soil. "He is going to grow his own food," she explained, "and he is going to establish a sustainable and renewable food source, and he is going to transform this temporary survival camp into something resembling a permanent homestead." Vel sat down heavily in a nearby chair and put his head in his hands and made a sound that might have been a groan of despair. "The examination is only 72 hours long," he said, and his voice was muffled by his hands, "and he does not need to establish agricultural production for a 3-day survival test." Una shrugged her shoulders and said, "He has to do something to keep himself occupied, and humans get very uncomfortable when we have nothing to work." And in the surface of Vareth 7, Tay worked on his garden throughout the morning hours, and he transplanted berry bushes that he had identified as edible, and root vegetables that would provide nutrition, and herbs that could be used for flavoring food or treating minor injuries. The stalkers watched him work with obvious curiosity and fascination, and occasionally Haniel would approach the garden plot and sniff at the newly planted vegetation, and Tay would gently push her away and make a low sound that clearly meant, "These plants are not for you." By midday, the garden was taking recognizable shape, and Tay stood back from his work and looked at what he had created with a critical eye and a sense of satisfaction. He looked around at the rest of his camp and realized that the restlessness was still there, and it was still gnawing at him like a hungry animal that refused to be satisfied. He walked to the edge of his cleared territory and looked out at the vast jungle that surrounded him on all sides, and the restlessness grew even stronger. This survival exam had been designed to be challenging and dangerous, and it was supposed to test the limits of what cadets could endure and overcome. Instead, it had become something like a vacation. Tay thought about the other cadets who were scattered across the surface of this moon, and he wondered how they were doing and whether they were struggling and suffering. He felt a small amount of guilt that he was so comfortable while others might be in pain and danger, but only a very small amount of guilt. He decided that he would go exploring and see more of this jungle moon that he had conquered so thoroughly. He gathered his weapons and whistled softly to the stalkers, and they rose from their resting positions with eager energy and followed him into the jungle with excited steps. They walked for hours through the dense vegetation, and he explored areas of the moon that he had not yet visited, and he mapped the terrain in his mind and noted the locations of resources and dangers and interesting features. He found a waterfall that dropped approximately 50 meters from a rocky cliff into a crystal blue pool below, and he stood at the edge of the cliff and watched the waterfall and felt the cool mist on his face and listened to the thundering roar of the cascade. He found a cave, the system that penetrated deep into the rock beneath the jungle floor, and he explored the first few chambers using a torch that he had made from a branch wrapped in animal fat soaked cloth, and the caves were cool and quiet and filled with strange formations of stone. He found a meadow hidden deep in the jungle that was filled with strange flowers that glowed faintly in the shadows with a soft blue bioluminescent light, and he picked one of the flowers and tucked it into his pocket as a souvenir. And everywhere he went, the stalkers followed him and protected him and watched for threats with their keen predator's senses, Tay felt like a king touring his domain and surveying the lands that belonged to him. And the observation deck, Admiral Oren arrived, in the company of several high-ranking military officials who had traveled to the academy specifically to see what all the commotion was about. The officials had heard reports about the human cadet who was doing impossible things on the survival examination, and they wanted to see the evidence for themselves. Led them to the screen, showing Tay and his pack of stalkers, and he explained in detail everything that had happened over the past 2.5 days. He described the forge and the weapons and the domestication of the predators and the establishment of the permanent camp, and now the creation of agricultural plots. Officials listened with expressions that shifted from skepticism to disbelief to something that looked very much like fear. One of them was a tall, thin alien with silver skin and no visible eyes who served on the Galactic Military Council, and he spoke in a flat, emotionless voice. "This situation is unprecedented in the history of this academy," he said. "Yes," Oren agreed quietly, "and it is unprecedented in the history of any military training institution." "That I am aware of." Another official was a stocky creature with thick green hide and multiple curved horns, who commanded a battle fleet, and he spoke in a gruff voice. "We should classify all of this information immediately," he said, "and we should not allow other species in the galaxy to learn what humans are truly capable of accomplishing." Shook his head slowly and said, "It is far too late for that, and there are hundreds of witnesses who have been watching these feeds for days, and the footage has been automatically recorded and archived in multiple locations." He looked at the screen where Tay was now walking through the meadow of glowing flowers with 3 deadly predators following at his heels like trained pets. "The galaxy will learn about human capabilities eventually," he said, "and perhaps it is better that they learn now while we have some control over the narrative in Varith 7. The sun was beginning to set, and Tay returned to his camp with his pack of stalkers trailing behind him. He felt slightly better after his hours of exploration, but the restlessness was still present in his chest, and it was still demanding that he find something meaningful to do. He sat by his fire and ate a meal of smoked meat and some of the vegetables he had gathered, and he looked around at everything he had built, and he felt a strange frustration building inside him. The examination was simply too easy. He was too comfortable and too safe and too well supplied. He needed something more challenging to occupy his time and his abilities. Tay stood up abruptly and walked to a large tree at the edge of his camp, and he pulled out his knife and began carving letters into the bark with quick, decisive strokes. Back at the academy, a junior instructor who was monitoring the feeds suddenly sat up straight in her chair and said in a loud voice, "Sir, you need to see what the human is doing right now." Vel walked over with heavy, tired steps and looked at the screen, and his yellow eyes went wide with chagrin. And the military officials pushed through the crowd to see what was happening, and when they saw the words that were being carved into the tree, they all fell completely silent. If Officio Tweet had carved the message in large, clear letters that were unmistakably visible to the surveillance drones that were monitoring his location, and he was now standing back from the tree and looking directly at the nearest camera with a challenging expression on his face. The observation deck erupted into chaos. Some of the alien cadets laughed nervously because they did not know how else to respond, and others made sounds of complete disbelief, and others simply stared at the screen with expressions that were unmistakably fearful. Instructor Vel threw all 4 of his hands into the air and walked away from the screens and sat down in the farthest corner of the room and refused to look at anything. Admiral Oren was silent for a very long time, and then he turned to look at the military officials who had come to observe. "You understand now what we are dealing with?" he asked them quietly. The officials did not respond with words, but their expressions said more than. Inuna was laughing so hard that tears were streaming down her face, and she had to lean against a wall to keep herself from falling over onto the floor. "That is the most human thing he could possibly have done," she said between gasps of laughter, "and he conquered every challenge this environment offered, and he got bored with the lack of opposition, and now he is actively requesting that someone give him a bigger and more difficult challenge to overcome." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked at the screen where Tay was now petting Bada and looking up at the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "This is what humans are," she said, And this is what you invited into your prestigious academy. And this is what you are training for positions in your military forces. He smiled with a fierce pride that made several of the nearby aliens take an involuntary step backward. Away from her, we do not just survive when faced with challenges, she said, and we get restless when the challenges stop on Vareth 7. The night had fully fallen, and Tay lay on his shelter platform and looked up at the unfamiliar patterns of stars through gaps in the jungle canopied. The restlessness in his chest had faded slightly after his act of defiance, and his message to whoever was watching him here. Still had approximately 25 hours remaining in the examination, and he still had absolutely nothing to worry about, and he was still bored, but there was something oddly comforting about being bored. Meant that he had won completely and totally, and there was nothing left that this moon could do to threaten him. He closed his eyes and let sleep begin to take him, and the stalkers kept their faithful watch at the perimeter of his camp and the jungle around them was quiet and peaceful. Somewhere across the vast expanse of the moon, other cadets were still fighting for their lives and struggling against the harsh environment and suffering through the worst experience of their existence, but Kang Tae was dreaming peacefully of bigger challenges and harder difficulties in distant worlds that might actually be able to test his capabilities. He smiled in his sleep, and somewhere in the darkness, Bada lifted his head and looked at his strange human pack member with something that might have been affection. Stars wheeled slowly overhead, and the moons of Vareth 7 cast their pale light through the canopy, and the night passed quietly toward dawn, and in the observation deck far above the jungle, an ancient admiral sat alone and stared at the words carved into the tree and wondered what the future would hold for a galaxy that contained creatures like humans. The morning of the final full day of the survival examination arrived in Kong. Tay woke to discover that Bada had moved during the night and was now lying directly beside the shelter platform with his massive head resting on his front paws and his intelligent yellow eyes watching Tay with something that looked remarkably like affection. Tay reached down from his platform and scratched gently behind the great predator ears, and Bada made a low rumbling sound deep in his chest that was almost like a purr of contentment. "Good morning, my friend," Tay said softly, and the stalker closed his eyes and leaned into the scratching with obvious pleasure. Haniel and Bile were positioned at the edge of the camp, and they were keeping watch over the surrounding jungle, and they turned their heads to look at Tay when he climbed down from his platform, and their tails wagged slightly with what appeared to be genuine happiness at seeing him awake. Tay smiled and felt a warmth spreading through his chest. He had not expected to become so attached to these magnificent creatures, but over the past 2.5 days, they had transformed from potential threats into loyal companions and trusted protectors. And something that felt very much like friends. The extraction shuttles would arrive in approximately 12 hours, and when they did, Tay would have to board one of them and fly back to the academy and leave the stalkers behind on this jungle moon. Forever, Tay pushed that uncomfortable thought firmly out of his mind and went about his morning routine. He washed in the stream and ate a breakfast of smoked meat and some berries from his garden, and checked his weapons and inspected his camp and made sure everything was in proper order. The day stretched out before him with nothing particular to fill it, and the restlessness from the previous day was still present, but it had become more manageable. He decided to spend his final hours on Vareth 7, exploring the parts of the moon that he had not yet had a chance to visit. In the observation deck at the academy, the countdown to the end of the survival examination had begun, and screens all around the room displayed the remaining time in large, glowing numbers. 12 hours remained. The screens also showed feeds from cadets all across the surface of the moon, and most of them had survived through the night, but many were clearly exhausted and injured and barely holding on to consciousness. Some cadets were limping through the jungle toward their designated extraction points, and some were huddled in caves, waiting for the shuttles to arrive, and some were lying still on the ground, and it was unclear whether they were sleeping or unconscious, or something worse. But the largest crowd was gathered around the screen, showing Kang Tae as it had been for the entire duration of the examination. The human was walking through the jungle with his pack of stalkers, and he was exploring a region near the toxic lowland valleys, and he looked as refreshed and energetic as he had on the first day of the exam. Instructor Vel stood at the front of the observation deck, and he had finally accepted that there was nothing normal about this particular cadet and nothing in his decades of experience as a survival instructor that could explain what he had witnessed. He watched the screen with an expression that had moved beyond confusion and beyond fear into something that resembled reluctant respect. Admiral Oren stood beside him, and the ancient headmaster had not slept more than a few hours in the past 3 days, and his eyes were tired, but his mind was sharp and active. The officials from the military council had departed the previous night, but they had left behind a request for a complete report on everything that had occurred during this examination. Oren knew that the report would be read by beings of great power and influence throughout the galaxy, and he knew that it would change how many species thought about humans. He was not certain whether that change would be for better or for worse. Vareth Sevente was walking along a ridge that overlooked one of the toxic valleys, and he was being careful to stay on the higher ground where the air was still breathable. The stalkers followed close behind him, and they were nervous in this area because they could sense that the environment below was dangerous and deadly. Tay stopped at a point where the ridge jutted out over the valley, and he looked down at the swirling green mists that filled the lower elevation, and he noted how the toxic gases seemed to flow like water and pool in the deepest areas. Nothing could survive down in those valleys for more than a few minutes, and even the hardy predators of Vareth 7 avoided the toxic zones completely. Tay filed this information away in his mind and was about to turn and continue his exploration when he heard something unexpected. It was a faint sound carried on the wind, and it was high-pitched and desperate, and it sounded unmistakably like a cry for help. Tay stopped and listened intently, and the stalkers stopped too, and their ears swiveled toward the direction of the sound. The cry came again, and it was definitely coming from somewhere in the valley below. Looked down at the toxic mists, and then looked at his stalkers, and considered his options. He could ignore the cry and continue his exploration, and whoever was down there would probably ignore. He could try to help. The decision was not difficult. Tom moved along the ridge and searched for a path that would allow him to descend into the valley, and he found a rocky slope that led to a ledge approximately halfway down the cliff face. The ledge was above the worst of the toxic gases, and the air there would still be breathable if he was careful. The cry came again, and it was louder now, and Tay could tell that whoever was making that sound was somewhere near the ledge he had identified. He began climbing down the rocky slope with careful, deliberate movements, and the stalkers followed him with obvious reluctance because every instinct in their predator brains was telling them that this area was dangerous. They reached the ledge after a difficult descent, and Tay looked around and saw a small cave opening in the rock face, and the cries were definitely coming from inside. That cave. He approached the opening and peered inside. What he saw made his heart twist with sympathy. There was a cadet. Huddled against the back wall of the cavern was a small alien with gray skin and large, dark eyes that seemed too big for its narrow face, and for thin arms that were wrapped around its body in a protective posture. Tay recognized the species as Valorian. He knew from his studies that they were known for their exceptional intelligence, but also for their physical weakness and fragility. The cadet looked up at Tay with eyes that were filled with terror, and then it saw the stalkers looming behind him in the cave entrance, and it screamed. "Wait," Tay said quickly and held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "And please do not be afraid, and the stalkers are with me, and they will not harm youth." Valori cadet was shaking violently, and tears were streaming from its enormous dark eyes, and it pressed itself further against the cave wall as if trying to push through the solid rock to escape. Tay made a hand signal to the stalkers, telling them to stay back, and then he entered the cave alone and moved slowly and carefully toward the terrified alien. "What is your name?" he asked. In the gentlest voice he could manage, the cadet stared at him with those huge wet eyes and trembled and finally spoke in a voice that was barely audible. "Sorry," the cadet said, "and my name is—" "Sorry, and please do not let those creatures eat me." "Okay, sorry," Tay said calmly, "and I promise that the stalkers will not hurt you, and they are my friends, and I am Kong Tay, and I am going to help you get out of here." He knelt down beside the small alien and examined him for injuries, and "Sorry," lynched away from his touch at first, but then gradually relaxed when he realized that the human was not going to hurt him. "What happened to you?" Tay asked, "and how did you end up in this cavessery?" Explained in a shaking voice that barely rose above a whisper. He had been dropped in the valley region on the first day of the examination, and the toxic gases had overwhelmed him almost immediately, and he had barely managed to climb to this ledge before collapsing. He had been hiding in this cave ever since, and he had been too weak to climb back up to safety, and too afraid to try to signal for extraction because his communicator had been damaged in his panicked escape from the toxic mist sea. Had been alone in this cave for almost 3 days, and he had no food and no water, and he had been slowly dying. Tay nodded as he listened, and his expression was serious and compassionate. "Tokay, sorry," he said, when the Valori had finished his story, "and we are going to get you out of here right now, and you are going to survive this examination." He helped Sori to his feet, and the small alien was so weak from dehydration and hunger that he could barely stand on his 4 thin legs. Tay ended up lifting Sori onto his back and carrying him because there was no way the Valori could climb the rocky slope on his own. The stalkers watched with curious eyes as Tay emerged from the cave with the small alien clinging to his back, and they sniffed at Sori but showed no aggression at all. It took Tay nearly an hour to climb back up to the ridge with Sori on his back, and the toxic air made the ascent even more difficult, but he pushed through the exhaustion and the strain. When they finally reached the top, Sori collapsed onto the ground and gasped for clean air, and Tay sat beside him and waited patiently for the small alien to recover enough to continue on the observation deck. A junior instructor who had been monitoring the secondary screens noticed something unusual and called out in an excited voicer, "There is activity on the Valori cadet feed, and something is happening." Valor walked over quickly and looked at the screen and saw Kong Tay carrying a small gray alien through a rocky landscape with 3 stalkers following close behind. "He is rescuing another cadet," Vel said, and his voice was filled with a strange mixture of disbelief and something that sounded almost like admiration. Admiral Oren pushed through the crowd to see what was happening, and he watched as Tay helped the Valori reach safe ground and sat with him while he recovered from his ordeal of "Now," Oren said quietly, and his voice was thoughtful and wondering, "and even now he continues to find ways to surprise." Asan Varith Tay helped Sori walk slowly back toward his established camp, and the journey took several hours because the small alien was so weak that they had to stop frequently. For rest, the stalkers walked alongside them, and occasionally, Bada would move closer to Sori and sniff at him, and the Valori would flinch with fear, but the great predator never showed any aggression. They finally reached the camp. Sori looked around with amazement, clearly visible in his huge dark eyes. "You built all of this?" Sori asked, and his voice was filled with wonder and disbelief. They nodded and said, "Yes, I did, and you can rest here until the extraction shuttles arrive, and you will be safe." He helped Sori climb onto the shelter platform and gave him water from one of the clay pots he had made and food from his stored supplies, and the small alien ate and drank with desperate urgency. Stalkers lay at the edge of the camp and watched the new arrival with calm, curious expressions, and Sori kept glancing at them nervously, but they made no move to approach. Sori looked at the stalkers and then looked at Tay and asked in a trembling voice, "How did you do all of this? And how did you survive so well? And how did you make those creatures follow you?" Tay sat down beside the fire and added some more wood and thought about how to answer the question. "I kept myself busy," he said finally, "and I used what was available, and I did not give up." Sori was silent for a long moment, and then tears began to fall from his enormous dark eyes again, but this time they were not tears of fear. "I thought I was going to die in that cave," Sori said, and his voice was choked with emotion, "and I thought I would never see my home world or my family ever again." Tay looked at him with compassionate eyes and said, "You are not going to die, and the extraction is coming in just a few hours, and you will make it home to your family." Sori nodded, and the tears continued to flow, and he whispered thank you in a voice that was barely audible, smiled gently and said, "You should rest now, and you are safe here, and nothing will hurt you while you are in my camp." On the observation deck, the crowd watched in silence as the human tended to the rescued cadet and made sure he was comfortable and had enough food and water. Yuna had tears in her eyes, and she wiped them away quickly because she did not want anyone to see her being emotional. "This is also what humans are," she said quietly, "and we do not just survive. And we do not just conquer and dominate, and we also protect those who are weaker than us. And we help those who are in need." Instructor Vel stood beside her, and his expression had changed significantly over the past few hours, and the fear and confusion that had dominated his face for days had been replaced with something that looked like genuine respect. "Perhaps," Vel said quietly, "and perhaps humans are not as dangerous as I initially believed them to." Bayuna smiled at him and shook her head. "We are absolutely dangerous," she said, "and make no mistake about that, and we are capable of incredible violence and destruction when we choose to be." She looked back at the screen where Tay was sitting by his fire while the Valori cadet slept peacefully on the shelter platform. "But we choose what to do with that capacity for danger," she said, "and sometimes we choose to build instead of destroy, and sometimes we choose to protect instead of attack, and sometimes we choose to help instead of harm." She paused, and her expression became thoughtful. "That is what makes humans truly unpredictable," she said, "and you never know which choice we will make until we make it." Admiral Oren stood in the shadows at the back of the observation deck and listened to the human woman speak, and he felt a complex mixture of emotions that he could not easily identify. Perhaps this was hope, perhaps it was fear, perhaps it was both at the same time. He looked at the screen where a human had built a civilization from nothing and tamed wild predators, and then used his power and resources to save a stranger who would have died without his help. And he wondered what kind of future awaited a galaxy that contained such beings. Final hours of the survival examination passed with agonizing slowness and Kang. Tay spent them sitting beside his fire and watching the jungle and thinking about what was coming and what he would have to leave. Behinsari, the Valori cadet that he had rescued from the toxic valley, was sleeping peacefully on the shelter platform, and his breathing had steadied and his color had improved significantly, and he would definitely survive to see the extraction shuttles arrive. The stalkers were resting at their usual positions around the perimeter of the camp, and they seemed to sense that something important was changing in their world, and they stayed closer to Tay than they normally did and watched him with those intelligent yellow eyes. Tay looked at Bada and felt a tightness forming in his chest that had nothing to do with the humid jungle air. He had spent less than 3 days with these magnificent creatures, but somehow in that short time they had become an important part of his life, and the thought of leaving them behind caused a pain that surprised him with its intensity. Bada lifted his massive head and looked at Tay and made a soft questioning sound that seemed to ask what was wrong. "I have to leave soon," Tay said quietly, and the stalker tilted his head as if he was trying very hard to understand the meaning behind the words. The extraction shuttles would arrive in approximately 2 hours, and Tay would board one of them and fly away from this jungle moon and return to the academy and continue his training, and the stalkers would remain here without him. Tay tried not to think about how they would feel when he disappeared and never came back, and whether they would wait for him at his abandoned camp and wonder where their strange human pack member had gone. He stood up and walked to where the stalkers were resting and sat down on the jungle floor among them, and immediately Bada pressed his massive warm body against Tay's side, and Hanyul and Bael moved closer to they sat together in a pile of fur and warmth, and Tay scratched behind their ears and stroked their sleek coats and tried to memorize every detail of how this felt. In the observation deck at the academy, the countdown to extraction had reached its final phase, and screens showed the landing coordinates for all of the shuttles that would be deployed to retrieve the surviving cadets. Instructor Vel was coordinating the retrieval operation and issuing orders to the shuttle pilots and making sure that every surviving cadet would be accounted for and brought safely home. Admiral Oren stood near the main screen that showed Tay sitting among his 3 stalkers, and the ancient headmaster watched with an expression that was difficult to read. Una stood beside him, and she had been crying quietly, and her eyes were red and swollen, but she did not seem embarrassed by her tears. "He is going to have to leave them behind," she said, and her voice was thick with emotion. "Yes," Oren said, "and that is the nature of this situation, and we cannot transport dangerous wildlife back to the academy, no matter how tame they may appear. Yuna nodded and wiped her eyes and said, I know, and I just wish there was another way on Vareth 7. Tay heard the distant rumble of shuttles entering the atmosphere high above, and he knew that his time with the stalkers was almost over. He gently extracted himself from the pile of predators and stood up and walked over to the shelter platform where Sori was beginning to stir from his sleep. The extraction is coming, Tay said, and we need to go to the designated landing zone. As Sori sat up slowly and looked around with his huge dark eyes and nodded, he climbed down from the platform with careful movements because he was still weak from his ordeal, and Tay helped steady him when he wobbled. On his 4 thin legs, Tay gathered his belongings and picked up the weapons he had forged and the clay pot he had made, and a pack of preserved food that he had prepared, and he looked around his camp. One final time it had been a good camp, and he had built it well, and he felt a sense of pride in what he had accomplished here. Then he turned to face the stalkers. Bada and Hanyul and Bael were standing at the edge of the camp, and they were watching him with expressions that showed they understood. Something important was happening, even if they did not understand exactly what come on. Tay said to them, and we are going to the extraction point. The stalkers followed him as they always did, and Tay led the way through the jungle toward the coordinates, where the shuttle would land with Sori walking beside him, and the pack trailing behind the extraction point was a large clearing approximately 1 kilometer from his camp, and when they arrived, Tay could already see the shuttle descending through the sky and growing larger as it approached. The shuttle landed at the far end of the clearing with a roar of engines and a blast of hot exhaust, and the engines powered down to an idle hum, but the boarding ramp remained sealed shut. Tay understood immediately why the pilot was not opening the door. 3 Vareth stalkers were standing at the edge of the clearing and watching the shuttle with curious predatory eyes, and any sensible pilot would refuse to exit their vehicle with those creatures. Nirbate turned to face his pack and looked at each of them. In turn, Boda was standing closest to him, and the Alpha stalker was watching him with those intelligent yellow eyes that seemed to hold a question. Hanyul was beside Bada, and her distinctive scarred ear was twitching nervously as she sensed the tension in the airbeal was hanging back slightly, and his darker fur made him almost invisible in the shadows at the edge of the clearing. Tay felt his throat tighten, and his eyes began to burn. With the threat of Terzai, have to go now, he said, and his voice was not quite steady. Boda winced softly and took a step toward Tay and pushed his massive head against Tay. Tay wrapped his arms around the great predator and held him tightly, and buried his face in the warm fur and let himself feel the loss that was crashing over him like a wave. Tay whispered, and I know, and I do not want to leave you either. He stayed like that for a long moment, and then he forced himself to let go and step back. He went to Hanyul next, and scratched behind her ears, and pressed his forehead against hers and whispered goodbye in a voice that cracked with emotion. Then he went to Ale and stroked the darker fur along his spine and told him to be good and to take care of his pack. Matest stalkers watched him with expressions of confusion and distress. They could tell that something terrible was happening, but they did not understand what or why. Tay stepped back from them and looked at them with tears now flowing freely down his face, and he made the low commanding sound that he had used to direct them during their hunts together. Go, he said, and go back to the jungle. The stalkers did not move, and they stared at him with pleading. Isko, Tay said again, and his voice was harder now, though it still trembled. Bada wind and took another step toward Tay, and Tay held up his hand firmly. No, he said, and you cannot come with me, and this is not your world, and the place I am going is not a place where you can survive. He pointed toward the jungle and made the commanding sound once more. Go, he said, and live and hunt and be free, and remember that you were loved. Beta stared at him with those yellow eyes for a long, terrible moment, and something passed between them that did not need words. Then the Alpha stalker lowered his great head in what might have been acceptance or might have been grief, and he turned and walked slowly toward the jungle. Hanyul and Bael followed there. Alpha and they looked back at Te several times as they walked, and their eyes were filled with confusion and sadness. Tay watched them until they disappeared into the dense vegetation, and then he wiped his face with his hands and took a deep shuddering Breathsari stood beside him, and the small Valori was watching with his huge dark eyes, and tears were streaming down his gray face. As well, they really loved you. Sori said in a quiet voice. Yes, Tay said, and I loved them too. The shuttle ramp finally opened now that the predators had departed, and a pilot emerged with wide, nervous eyes and looked around the clearing as if expecting the stalkers to return at any moment. Are they gone? The pilot asked in a voice that was trying and failing to sound. Kamis, Tay said, and they are gone. He helped Sori up the boarding ramp and into the shuttle, and settled the small alien into his seat and made sure his safety harness was properly secured. Then Tay took his own seat near a window and strapped himself. Enan looked out at the jungle where his friends had vanished. The shuttle lifted off with a roar of engines and rose up through the atmosphere, and row 7 grew smaller and smaller in the window until it was just a green and blue sphere hanging. In the blackness of space, Tay watched the jungle moon until it disappeared entirely, and then he closed his eyes and let himself grieve on the observation deck at the academy. The crowd had been silent throughout the farewell scene, and many of them had tears on their faces, regardless of their species. Instructor Vel, who had been so frightened and confused by everything the human had done, was wiping moisture from his yellow eyes with one of his forehands. Ayuna was openly sobbing, and she did not try to hide it or apologize for it. Tadmiral Oren stood at the front of the observation deck, and his ancient face was thoughtful and moved. The moment was important, he said quietly, and what we just witnessed was a human saying goodbye to creatures he had known for less than 3 days, but had somehow come to love deeply. He looked around at the gathered cadets and instructors. That capacity for forming rapid and intense emotional bonds is another thing that makes humans unique. He said, and they do not just domesticate animals, and they form genuine relationships with them. He paused and his voice became softer. They grieve when those relationships end, even when the ending was inevitable from the beginning. The shuttle carrying Tay and Sori docked at the Academy station approximately 2 hours after departure, and the surviving cadets were directed to proceed to the medical bay for mandatory examination and treatment. Sori was loaded onto a medical stretcher because he was still too weak to walk unassisted, and as they were about to take him away, he reached out and grabbed Tay hand. Thank you, Sori said, and his huge dark eyes were filled with gratitude and something like wonder. And I will never forget what you did for me, and I will tell everyone about the human who saved my life. Tay smiled at him gently and squeezed his thin gray hand. Take care of yourself, Sori, he said, and go home to your family and live a good life. They took Sori away, and Tay walked to the medical bay on his own and sat down on an examination table and let the medical officers scan him and poke him and run their tests. They found no injuries of any kind, and no illnesses, and no deficiencies. In fact, the head medical officer looked at his datapad with obvious confusion and said, "You appear to be in better physical condition than you were when you started the examination, and how is that possible?" Tay shrugged and said, "I ate well and got plenty of rest." The medical officer stared at him and then stared at the datapad and then shook his head and cleared Tay for release. Tay fourth release day walked out of the medical bay and into the main corridor of the academy, and the other surviving cadets were emerging from their own examinations. Looked exhausted and traumatized, and many of them were covered in bandages and walking with limps, and some of them were crying quietly. Tay walked among them and felt out of place. He was refreshed and healthy, and his only injury was the ache in his heart from leaving the stalkers behind, and that was not a wound that medical scanners could detect. Word had spread throughout the academy about what he had done during the examination, and cadets and instructors of every species stopped what they were doing to stare at him as he walked past. Some looked at him with fear in their eyes, and some looked at him with something like awe, and some looked at him with barely concealed hostility and resentment. Tay ignored them all. He walked to the academy cafeteria because he was hungry and because he wanted to sit somewhere quiet and process everything that had happened. He sat down at an empty table in a corner and ordered a simple meal and ate it slowly and stared at nothing in particular. He was halfway through his meal when someone sat down in the seat across from him. It was Yuna Park, and she looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and messy, tangled hair, but she was smiling at him with warmth and understanding. "Hey," she said softly, "and welcome back, Tay." looked up at her and nodded and said thanks. Yuna studied his face for a moment, and her smile faded slightly. You look sad, she said. Tay thought about Bada and Hanyul and Bael, and the way they had looked at him when he told them to go away, and the confusion and hurt in their intelligent, yellow eyes. He nodded slowly. I left some friends behind, he said. Yuna reached across the table and put her hand on his and squeezed gently with a compassion that made his eyes sting a gunny. No, she said, and I watched the whole thing, and I am so sorry. Tae looked at her and felt grateful for her presence, and grateful that there was someone who understood what he had lost. They sat together in the cafeteria and ate in comfortable silence, and the other cadets and instructors continued to stare, but neither of them paid any attention outside the cafeteria. Windows, the stars shone coldly in the eternal darkness of space, and somewhere very far away on a jungle moon 3, stalkers were howling at the sky and wondering where their human had gone. The cafeteria of the Galactic Military Academy was quieter than usual in the hours following the end of the survival examination, and most of the cadets had retreated to their quarters to rest and recover from the ordeal they had endured. Kung Tae sat at his corner table with Yuna and finished his meal slowly and thought about everything that had happened over the past 3 days and everything that would happen in the days and weeks and years to come. Door to the cafeteria slammed open with a crash that made everyone in the room jump, and Rico the Tazari cadet stormed through the entrance with rage, burning bright and hot in his reptilian eyes. He marched across the room with heavy, aggressive steps and stopped directly in front of the table and slammed his clawed hands down on the surface so hard that the plates and cups rattled. How Rico demanded, and his voice was loud enough that everyone in the cafeteria could hear him clearly. And how did you do it, Tae? Looked up at him with calm, dark eyes that showed no fear and no anger, and said simply, do what exactly? Everything, Rico hissed, and the sound was sharp and venomous, and the forge and the weapons and the predators and everything else that you accomplished on that moon. Other cadets in the cafeteria had stopped eating and turned to watch the confrontation, and some of them looked nervous, and some of them looked eager to see what would happen next. Tuna started to stand up with a defensive expression on her face, but Tae held up a hand to stop her, and she settled back into her seat with obvious reluctance. Tae pushed his food tray aside and looked at Rico without any expression on his face. Used what was available to me, he said in a calm, measured voice, and I adapted to the environment one found myself in, and I solved problems as they arose using the skills and knowledge I possessed. Rico slammed the table again, and his scales had turned a dark, angry shade of green. That is not a real answer, he shouted, and you must have cheated somehow, and you must have brought extra supplies or had outside help or done something that violated the rules of the examination. Yuna stood up despite Tae's silent request and faced Rico with hard, determined eyes. He did not cheat, she said firmly, and the footage proves that he accomplished everything using only the materials available on the planet's surface, and you are embarrassing yourself in front of the entire Akadama. Rico turned his rage toward her, and his teeth were bared in a threatening display. Stay out of this, human, he snarled, and this is between me and your friend, and it does not concern you. Tae stood up slowly from his seat and unfolded to his full height, and he was taller than Rico by several centimeters and broader in the shoulders, and his calm presence seemed to fill the space around him. The Tasari took an involuntary step backward before he could stop himself. We'll tell you how I did it, Tae said, and his voice was quiet, but it carried through the silent cafeteria, and everyone could hear every word. He stepped around the table and stood directly in front of Rico and looked down at him with those calm, dark eyes. I did not panic when I landed on that moon, he said, and when I found myself in a hostile environment with minimal resources, I did not waste time and energy being afraid, and instead I assessed my situation and made a plan, and then I executed that plan. Said nothing, but his scales had turned even paler. I used knowledge that I had accumulated over my entire lifetime. Tae continued, and I knew how to make fire because humans have been making fire for hundreds of thousands of years, and I knew how to find food because humans have been hunting and gathering for hundreds of thousands of years, and I knew how to build shelter because humans have been constructing dwellings for hundreds of thousands of years. He took another step closer, and Rico took another step back. I knew how to work metal because humans have been smelting ore and forging tools For thousands of years, he said, and I knew how to read animal behavior because humans have been studying and domesticating animals for thousands of years. His voice became quieter, but somehow more intense. I worked constantly while I was on that moon. He said, and while you were hiding in a cave and waiting to be rescued, and hoping that you would not die, I was building a forge and creating weapons, and hunting food, and establishing a permanent settlement. Trico's body was trembling, and his eyes were wide, and he looked like he desperately wanted to run away, but could not make his legs cooperate. While you were crying and giving up, I was making that world my own, Tay said, and while you were waiting for the exam to end, I was asking for a harder challenge because I had already conquered everything that Moon could throw at me. He looked around the cafeteria at all the alien cadets, who were watching the confrontation with wide eyes and open mouths. That is the difference between us, Tay said. And I was born on a planet that has been trying to kill humans for our entire existence as a species, and I spent my whole life learning how to fight back and survive and win against impossible odds. He looked back at Rico, and his expression was not angry, but it was also not friendly. You asked how I did what I did on Vareth 7, he said, and the answer is simple. He paused for a moment and let the silence stretch. Am human, he said, and that is all the explanation you need. Draco stared at him for a long, terrible moment, and his mouth opened and closed several times as if he wanted to say something but could not find any words. Then he turned and fled from the cafeteria without looking back, and the door slammed shut behind him. The room was completely silent for several seconds, and then slowly conversations began to resume, and cadets went back to their meals, although many of them kept glancing nervously at the human who had just delivered such a devastating speech. Tay sat back down in his seat, and Eunice sat beside him, and she was smiling with fierce pride that lit up her entire face. That was absolutely amazing, she said, and I wish I had recorded it so I could watch it again whenever I needed inspiration. Tay shrugged and said, it was just the truth, and nothing more. In his private office high in the central tower of the Academy, Admiral Oren sat at his desk and reviewed the complete footage from the survival examination for what must have been the 20th time. He had watched every moment of what Kong Tay had accomplished, and he had studied the data and the analysis reports and the commentary from the instructors, and he still felt like he did not fully understand what he had witnessed on one screen. Tay was building a forge from raw materials that he had gathered from the jungle floor, and the speed and efficiency of his work was remarkable and showed a level of knowledge and skill that most species would require years of formal training to develop on. Another screen, Tay was sitting among 3 Vareth stalkers and petting them like they were domesticated pets rather than apex predators capable of killing most beings in seconds. A third screen, Tay was carving the words, "Is there a harder difficulty?" into a tree trunk and looking directly at the surveillance camera with an expression that was somehow both challenging and amused. Doran paused the footage and leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling and thought about what all of this meant for the future. Humans had been part of the galactic community for less than 50 standard years, and in that time they had been generally regarded as newcomers who had much to learn from the older and more established civilizations. Most species looked at humans and saw beings with no natural weapons and no protective armor and no obvious biological advantages, and they assumed that humans must be weak and vulnerable and easily controlled. Doran now understood how dangerously wrong those assumptions had been. He opened a new file on his computer and began to type a report that would be distributed to military leaders and political officials throughout the galaxy. Human species assessment update, he typed at the top of the document. He paused and considered his words carefully, and then continued. Previous assessments of human capabilities have been based on incomplete data and outdated assumptions, and this report provides updated analysis based on direct observation of human behavior under extreme survival conditions. He described the survival examination in detail and documented everything that Tay had accomplished, and included timestamps and references to the archived footage. Then he reached the section of the report that would be most carefully read by the beings who received ITH, labeled this section Tactical Recommendations, and he thought very carefully about what to write. He thought about the forge and the weapons, and the resourcefulness that had allowed a single human to transform raw materials into functional tools in less than a day. He thought about the domestication of 3 apex predators and the psychological techniques that had allowed the human to integrate himself into their pack hierarchy in less than 3 days. He thought about the message carved into the tree in the restless boredom of a human who had conquered every challenge a deadly moon could offer and wanted something harder. Thought about the rescue of the Valori cadet and the compassion and selflessness that had driven the human to risk his own safety to help a stranger he. Thought about the tears the human had shed when saying goodbye to the predators he had tamed, and the depth of emotional attachment that could form in such a short time. Then he began to type his recommendations due. Not engage human forces in prolonged ground conflicts, he wrote, and they will adapt to any environment faster than any other known species, and they will use local resources to create weapons and tools that can overcome any initial disadvantage. Do not strand humans on hostile worlds with the expectation that they will simply die, he continued, and they will not merely survive such conditions but will begin to establish permanent settlements and exploit local resources within days of arrival. Do not underestimate human endurance or creativity or determination, he wrote, and they will solve problems in ways that other species cannot anticipate, and they will refuse to accept situations as impossible. No matter how hopeless they may appear, do not assume that human compassion is a weakness that can be exploited, he added, and their tendency to protect and assist those weaker than themselves creates loyalty and alliances that can shift the balance of power in unexpected ways. He paused and reread what he had written and then added one final line that summarized everything he had learned. If given sufficient time and available resources, humans do not merely survive hostile conditions, and they conquer them. He saved the file and closed it and sat back in his chair and looked out the window at the stars that filled the darkness of space. The galaxy was vast and filled with ancient civilizations and powerful empires and dangerous species that had been expanding and competing and warring for millions of years. But Orin was beginning to suspect that the most dangerous thing in the entire galaxy might be the species that had only recently arrived on the cosmic stage, the species that got bored when there was nothing left to fight, against the species that asked for harder challenges when they had already overcome everything in their path. Next day, there was a formal ceremony in the Academy main auditorium to honor the cadets who had successfully completed the survival examination. Orin stood on the elevated stage at the front of the massive room and called out names one by one, and cadets walked up to receive their certificates of completion, while the assembled audience applauded. Some cadets walked with limps, and some had arms in slings, and some had bandages covering injuries they had sustained during their 3 days on Vareth 7. When Orin called the name Kang Tae, the auditorium fell completely silent. Walked up to the stage with confident, steady steps and stood before the Admiral and accepted his certificate, and the room remained absolutely quiet, as if everyone was holding their breath. Thorin looked at him with ancient knowing eyes that had seen thousands of cadets pass through this academy over the decades. "Congratulations, Cadet Kong," he said, and his voice carried through the silent auditorium. "And you have set a new standard for this examination that will likely never be matched." Tate nodded respectfully and said, "Thank you, Admiral High," walked back to his seat and sat down, and the ceremony continued, but many eyes in the auditorium remained fixed on him throughout the rest of the proceedings. After the ceremony was over, Yuna found Tay in the corridor outside the auditorium and walked beside him as they headed toward the residential section of the academy. "So what happens now?" she asked. "And what will you do next? Now that you have become the most famous cadet in the history of this institution?" I thought about the question and remembered the restlessness he had felt on Vareth 7 and the way he had carved that message into the tree, asking for something harder to overcome. "My will find something more challenging," he said, "and I will keep pushing myself and testing my limits until I find something that actually requires me to struggle." Yuna laughed and said, "That is the most human response possible." They walked together through the academy corridors, and cadets of every species watched them pass, and some looked at Tay with fear, and some with respect, and some with curiosity about what he might do next. Tay did not notice any of them, because his mind was already looking forward to the future, was thinking about the challenges that awaited him, and the obstacles he would need to overcome, and the worlds he might someday be asked to survive on. He hoped those future challenges would be harder than Vareth 7 had been hit. Hoped they would actually test his abilities and push him to his limits. Hoped they would give him something meaningful to fight against, because Kongte was human, and humans did not simply survive when faced with difficulties. They got restless when things were too easy, and they went looking for something to conquer them. Galaxy had no idea what was coming in the years and decades ahead, but it would learn a jungle moon very far away. 3 Vareth stalkers sat at the edge of an abandoned clearing and looked up at the night sky filled with unfamiliar stars. They did not understand where their human had gone, or why he had left them behind, but somewhere deep in their predator minds, they remembered a strange creature who had not been afraid of them and who had fed them and protected them and been their friend, and they missed him. Bada lifted his great head and howled at the distant stars, and the mournful sound echoed through the jungle and into the endless darkness above. Somewhere among those countless points of light, his human was out there, and maybe someday he would return. Maybe someday Bada would hear familiar footsteps in the jungle and smell a familiar scent on the wind, and his human would come walking out of the trees with that calm, confident expression and scratch behind his ears and call him by name. The Alpha Stalker lowered his head and lay down at the edge of the clearing, and Hanyul and Bayao lay down beside him, and they waited. They would wait for a very long time, but stalkers were patient creatures, and they had nothing but time and hope. High above the jungle moon in the cold emptiness of space, a young human was looking out a window at the stars and thinking about 3 friends he had left behind. Tay touched the glass with his fingertips and whispered a promise that no one else could hear. Rai will come back for you someday, he said, and I do not know when, and I do not know how, but I will find a way. The stars did not answer, but somewhere very far away, 3 stalkers lifted their heads, as if they had heard something, and the universe continued turning as it always had, and humans continued doing what humans had always done. They survived, and they adapted, and they conquered him. They never ever gave up. The end.